I'm going to tell you, take a more foundational and principled approach in thinking about designing distributed ledgers. So there is a bunch of questions that I hope we can manage to delve into in this presentation. And what I want to start with is the why. What are the novel elements that were put forth by blockchain protocols in the context of designing and deploying information technology services? And in order to appreciate this why, I'd like to just remind everyone, what is the classical way of we're thinking about organizing an IT system, any IT system that follows this client-server paradigm? So we have clients with servers. The servers will provide the service to the clients, and we have these broad objectives of being performant, cost-efficient, scalable, and resilient to faults. So what happened with the advent of blockchain technology, there was a realization that there is a different way that we can try to use to organize an IT system. So what you see, like, say, in this classical way of thinking about system organization, which you can think of it as a centralized organization, is that the servers, they offer the service, and they belong to a security perimeter. There is an organization that provides the servers, and this security perimeter somehow divides the outside of the system that has the clients and potentially malicious actors, and the inside of the system, which is basic infrastructure, and should be resilient to faults. But these faults are not of this so-called Byzantine or malicious type. They are like benign faults. Like there is energy failures, there is hard disk crashes, and the system is supposed to tolerate those and be able to provide service to the clients while keeping all the bad actors outside, which would exist and would try to penetrate the system, but they would remain outside because there is this security perimeter that keeps them out. And this is like a fundamental paradigm that a lot of IT infrastructure follows. Now, with the advent of the Bitcoin blockchain and related technology, there's a realization that there's a new way to organize the system where there is no clearly defined security perimeter. There is no inside and outside. So it's somehow possible for a set of servers and clients all together organize in some fashion and provide the service without actually being able to distinguish a clear outside and inside. So here the Byzantine or malicious actors are within the system. And despite that, the system is supposed to operate and offer the functionality it's supposed to offer. So this paradigm was inspiring, just the realization that it's possible to do that. And there are many arguments that were put in favor of that. One that we heard already in a number, and touched already a number of presentations so far, was the breadth of such a system. And the breadth here means that once you can organize a system like that, you don't have to rely on standard organizational structures. So you can go across those barriers, and you can organize a system that can include many different organizations. Information silos can also be penetrated, so somehow information can be organized going across a single organization. The liability becomes limited because no participant is the sole custodian of the service and the database, and there is no single point of failure. Now, at the same time, there were a number of disadvantages that were widely realized and pointed out. Just the fact that you organize a system like that, the performance is bound to have a hit. Byzantine behavior from within is something that's going to be fundamentally expensive to deal with. The incentive structure of organizing this may collapse. Like, why are all these entities organized in that system? I mean, in the old paradigm, the incentive structure was somehow abstracted away from the system, right? So there was one organization that would provide the infrastructure that is somehow incentivized to do that, and this was not part of what the system was solving. But now we have to think about this incentive structure as part of the system design. Sharing information across these boundaries may have privacy implications, and scalability is bound also to be hurt, because growing the system capacity may not necessarily imply that you have higher throughput and performance. So if this is like the why we're interested in that, the next question is like, how does blockchain fit into the wider computer science context? And what is exactly the problem that it's solving? We already heard very nice presentations already this morning covering this, but I would like to add a couple of things that I think are worth to be discussed. So as all of you know, the consensus problem, which is at the core of what is the functionality of these protocols, is a classical problem in computer science, a beautiful problem in computer science. One of these problems in computer science that is inspiring in the sense that it's a simple problem to define and surprisingly difficult to solve. So in the context of this of the Bitcoin blockchain and related systems, what we have is we want to agree on a transaction history, and we want to make sure that this is continuously updated. Now, these informal statements, and I think this is a good takeaway point here, they can be substituted by precise mathematical statements. And I think this is very important here. It is important to sort of remember and realize that there has been a substantial investment of time in computer science research to isolate these properties and express them formally with precision. And it's possible to come up with formal definitions, mathematical definitions of what is consistency and what is liveness, which is the two key properties that someone expects from a system that provides consensus in the form of a ledger. Consistency says basically that there is this log, and this log of transactions that as the system is queried over different points of time, it remains consistent. So the log at a certain time will be a prefix of the log at a future time, and you will not have inconsistencies over time. Liveness at the same time is the property that says that the log grows. So as new information is produced, is incorporated in the system in a way that clients, for example, that submit information, they have this information incorporated in the system. So if this was the what is also important to keep in mind is that we do have the tools also to express mathematically the how. How is a protocol supposed to provide these properties? And even though this slide is quite high level, the nice thing about this is that it's possible to produce precise mathematical definitions of how exactly a protocol is supposed to give you these properties of consistency and liveness. And this comes in the form of a threat model that describes exactly what may happen in the system while quantifying over all possible strategies that a malicious actor may operate within the system. And then here is described how clients can read the log post-transactions and how the malicious actors acting from both within and outside the system as a client may interfere with that. So a consensus protocol thus is a protocol that provably facilitates consistency and liveness. And we do have a lot of examples of those protocols, starting from protocols that go back to the beginning of the introduction of the problem in the 80s till nowadays with this advent of blockchain protocols. So why there is interest in this blockchain protocol specifically, since this consensus problem is something that we have solved and we have looked at for decades? What was the prior work that was fundamental to its inception? And are there any new fundamental questions in computer science that were highlighted by the introduction of this type of protocol? So something here which is new in the context of computer science is the fact that the way we looked at this problem in the literature till the advent of the Bitcoin blockchain protocol was not quite the same as it was highlighted with the Bitcoin blockchain. There was a fundamental difference in all the research that was basically investigated in the decades prior to 2008, 2009 that the Bitcoin blockchain was introduced, with just very few, almost negligible exceptions. The key difference was that even though the Byzantine model was put forth, there was always an assumption about a setup that organized the set of servers that are going to solve the problem and gave them identities, essentially. So this is a very big assumption. In other words, to do consensus, we were already assuming that some consensus was already given in the form of a setup about the identities of the servers that are acting in the system. And this assumption that basically was present in the vast majority of the literature prior to the advent of the Bitcoin blockchain is something that was removed in this decentralized type of consensus protocols that are pointed out by the Bitcoin blockchain. So where classically server identification and membership was practically static, you had these n servers giving you consensus, and maybe some of them are malicious. In this setting, there are no n servers. Actually, the participants of the protocol don't even know how many servers are active at any given time. And this is what typifies this blockchain consensus setting, and it's fundamentally new. There were actually just very few papers that were published in fringe, I would say, conferences prior to 2008, 2009 that asked the question, how is it possible to do consensus if you don't have names, if you don't have identities? And that's very interesting, that somehow this problem was ignored in the literature of distributed systems. So, as very nicely Nigel presented in the first talk today, there was a lot of fundamental prior work that influenced the Bitcoin blockchain. So I would just point out to some of them that was really instrumental. So the first very instrumental aspect was proof of work that was understood as a concept that can fight denial of service in settings where you don't have authentication. Then we have the development of peer-to-peer networks, the utilization of hash chains, which we also seen how important they were, and the wider understanding that Sybil attacks are a serious problem. So as you see, all these questions fundamentally point to the fact that the agreeing on identities is really a very difficult question. And if we are to build systems that achieve consensus at a wide scale, solving the identity problem should be part of the design question. We cannot assume it as a trusted setup, as an assumption, as it has happened with the majority of the literature prior to the advent of these systems. So what are the fundamental CS problems that are highlighted? So first of all, I would say just the Byzantine threat model is something that came forward. Even though the Byzantine threat model was something that we've analyzed and we had systems built on that operated in the Byzantine threat model, from a practical point of view, from a practice point of view, this was not something that was used. So basically what was happening is that since we were in this classical client-server setting with a security perimeter, there was no need for the Byzantine threat model. Actually, people that worked on Byzantine agreement were essentially theoreticians, and those that actually implemented system, they didn't use the Byzantine threat model, because there is no need for that. You just want to solve consensus in a weaker model, which is just benign faults. It's also an interesting question, by the way, to solve the problem with benign faults, but fundamentally easier. So the next thing, though, that is intrinsic to the Bitcoin setting is that we want to solve consensus in environments where participation is highly fluctuating and uncertain. I should say this is an interesting question from a theoretical point of view. there are many use cases, many of them that we were discussing this morning, that do not necessarily need consensus on a highly fluctuating and uncertain set of participants. Bitcoin tries to solve consensus in that setting. Proof of work-based consensus tries to provide consensus in that setting. But for a large number of applications that are high value, we may not need a consensus protocol that has this ability to tolerate highly fluctuating and uncertain environments. The other point which is fundamental, though, is like incentive mechanisms. We are really so behind in terms of research in understanding the consensus problem from an incentive point of view. The classical way of looking at the problem is like there are the bad guys, Byzantine actors, and there are the good guys, and that's it. There is no question why the good guys are good. And this is an oversimplification. If you want to organize a system in a decentralized fashion, let's say global scale consensus, you have to think about the incentives of the honest participants. The honest participants, they cannot be just assumed that they run the protocol because someone told them. There is no curator. There is no higher source that somehow will incentivize them and make them honest. Solving incentives is fundamentally a question that has to be addressed within the design. And finally, another very interesting question now is that from a programming point of view, there is this new paradigm for organizing services in this tripartite setting, where it's not just a client and server, but there is a mutually distrusting client and server that operate together with a third entity, which is the blockchain. So this client-server blockchain programming of services in itself is a very interesting question of how is it possible to write applications effectively that use the blockchain as a so-called smart contract functionality. So these are the new questions, and now I'll just make a little bit of an advocation why a globally scalable decentralized IT infrastructure might be needed and what we should do about it. So the first thing, and these are like thoughts that I'd like to share with you, these are well-known facts, but I think it's important to keep them in mind and see how we can influence the development of these systems using those facts. First of all, we live at a time that information technology services are breaking records of scale, amazing records of scale. We're talking about systems with billions of users. I mean, this is remarkable. The immensity of that is remarkable. And I cite Facebook and WeChat, obviously, as the systems with a high number of users, but I think also M-Pesa in Africa with mobile payments, even though a much smaller scale, is also a development which is really important in terms of its scale. So who provides those services? Another point to keep in mind, and I think it's very interesting, is that 69 of the richest 100 entities of the world are not countries. It seems obvious, right? It seems like an obvious fact. Yeah, when you see that, you say, yes, it's not very surprising. But just think about this. It's just 31 countries that managed to make it to the top 100. So, and corporations are not by default evil or negative, but they try to maximize and under a set of constraints that are given to them, provided to them, and inevitably the choices they do lead to problems. Data breaches, there's no question about this. Like, we all know what is the impact of them and how much they're growing over the last few years. 4 billion records, let's say, compromised in the last few years. Internet in Africa. In many countries in Africa, internet means Facebook. It's the same thing. That's surprising. It's something surprising, let's say, to us coming from here, that we think internet as this public resource that we can use. This is not the same landscape that is there. And what is at stake? So what is at stake, I would say, is a lot of things. We have all these basic rights, and the question is, how can fundamental rights such as those on the left be preserved in a setting where IT services transcend jurisdictional boundaries at the scale that we just saw. And clearly, all companies, for their own reasons and for good reasons, to maximize their profits, will play a game of regulatory arbitrage. And at the same time, we have to think that also innovation is at stake. How is it possible to truly innovate if the necessary underlying infrastructure to innovate is privately controlled? So I would say this is a call, and this is a call that we have to take it seriously. The thing is that what is the promise, I think, here for blockchain and distributed ledger technology is that it can be instrumental in building this neutral ground. Neutral ground over which some form of democratization of this emerging IT infrastructure that we have can take place. And we can go from an internet of servers, so to speak, to an internet of value, where actually value can reliably transferred and somehow democratically debated and organized. So the objectives of this is basically facilitate the implementation of fundamental rights in the context of IT, so that on the one side, effective enforcement can be achieved, checks and balances are in place, but also dissent is facilitated, because without dissent it is not possible for a system to effectively evolve. So, coming to the last question that I wanted to put forth. How much more time do I have, John? 2 minutes, okay. That's going to be quick. I just want to point to a number of challenges that are critical right now for the space. And all of them, I have to say none of them is currently now categorically solved. We're doing progress. We're doing a lot of progress in these directions. But I would say, even though we have a very good understanding, what is needed is take a principled approach to understand this technology, provide protocols that meaningfully solve these problems, following sound mathematical models and proofs that actually the problems are solved, and then engage and communicate widely so that these solutions actually find themselves in reasonable and good use cases that actually matter. So I have a few more slides that basically describe some of the work we did at Edinburgh University on the topic, but given the lack of time, yeah, I'll just have the slides. I'll just have the slides online, and I'll just end with this methodology where security by design is something that has to be followed here, as opposed to establishing properties via just experiments or moving fast and breaking things. So thank you.
Mathematically, it can be proven where this transaction has happened, and then if we can agree on this time as well, these two components, how can you communicate time appropriately across multiple nodes?
Yeah, so just the notion of time itself is something that is subject to consensus. So one approach that's something you can take, one approach here is that the system itself defines time. So basically, as long as we have a point of reference, because time, after all, is something that we have to agree on, and we have to use as a point of reference. Actually, a lot of the work that's happening right now in research regarding consensus protocols is figuring out how to build a global concept of time as part of the consensus question. So this is some of the research, actually, that I had in the slides that I didn't show. But I would say there is still like a lot of interesting questions about how to design systems, or what are the absolute minimum assumptions that are necessary for consensus, so that actually time is something that can be exported by the consensus protocol, as opposed to used as an assumption. And I think this is still remains a very interesting research question.
Yeah, maybe just thank you for the talk. That was very interesting.
methodology side, would it not be wise to include two more things? So, except for security by design, I think privacy by design is fundamental, as well as data sovereignty. That, the way that we now deal with data, we just give it away for the funny games we get on the mobile. But we should be owners of our own data and be able to shift it from one to the other. I think those are very important methodological fundaments in whatever we design.
Absolutely, and I think this is a very good point. And I would say, and I should say here that when I talk about security, I talk about security in the broadest possible sense, and I think like all the basic properties, for example, like the ones that are quoted here, have to be approached exactly in the same principle approach. So I absolutely agree, and these are very good points.
Elaborate on the sort of regulatory arbitrage that you sort of touched on? I mean, it's a very general question here. I mean, you sort of suggested DLT may be a panacea to avoid this, but personally, I don't really see this myself.
Right. So, well, the point here, I think like the direction that we're moving is like this area called regulatory technology, where basically how is it possible, for example, to automate reporting, and automating reporting requirements. So one possible direction here is making sure that the regulators have a point of reference in terms of data that will create this neutral somehow ground that it's possible for example, by automating the reporting of that information, if it's necessary, it will make it feasible to control how a certain entity manages its transactions. So just to make this a bit more specific, for example, like in banking, there is all kinds of regulations about anti-money laundering. And it's really up to every individual bank to do this reporting. Being able to engage in reporting in a way that the information is shared, for example, across all banks, and then like there are automated algorithms that use that information to extract information and figure out where exactly interesting events are happening, is something that the regulators could use. So this is just one example, but it's one of many.
And you talk about time-stamping trades. That's another great example.
Yeah.
They're a law unto themselves.
So I just, the point about regulatory arbitrage is, I think, like from a regulatory point of view, our regulation agencies, they are really behind in the tools they use compared with the companies they try to regulate. So what I'm pointing out is that I think this DLT can be used in that context to enhance the technological capabilities of regulators so that they can more effectively regulate. So I think in itself what I'm saying is not really a controversial point. It's just a point that says, if you look at all regulators now, it's clear that technologically they are far behind what they actually manage to regulate. And companies on the other side, they do what's best for them. And that makes perfect sense. Like, it makes perfect sense from a company point of view to do regulatory arbitrage. So, yeah.